Hi, my name is Tess Kessler. I'm a fellow with the O'Brien Notre Dame International Security Center, and I'm here with Professor Erik Gartzke of the University of California, San Diego. Could you start by summarizing your seminar topic and briefly highlighting your main arguments?
Yes, today I'm going to talk about arms races, and while that's a venerable topic that many people have covered before, we have my co-author and I have a different take on it. And we're going to argue that actually what countries do is they try to pursue the arms race differently from each other. So think of the rock, paper, scissors game that you might have played with friends when you were a kid.
Got it. And so if rivals compete through offsets and this rock, paper, scissors strategy, instead of matching each other in arms procurement, do you think that makes deterrence and stability harder or easier to achieve?
Well, the risk is that when you make something more complicated, it increases the likelihood that somebody gets it wrong. The fact that somebody like me is having to look at this carefully, maybe several hundred years after arms races began as a thing in the world, suggests that there is a real risk to misperceive it, to get it wrong in some way. But the flip side is that maybe it also creates more tools that allow statespersons to do a better job of getting what they want for their country without causing a war.
Got it. So in the conclusion of your read ahead, you briefly mentioned military competition between China and the United States as asymmetric. Could you expand on your theory of qualitative arms racing and how that helps us understand this rivalry, and then what it suggests about how each side is developing in their strategy?
Yeah, so the long-held belief was that arms races caused war. But an arms race is an anticipation of a war. And so what we're hopeful for is that potentially sometimes arms races can be a substitute for war. They're not a good thing, but maybe they're a less bad thing than the alternative. And so in the case of the US and China, it's possible that an extended period of military buildup and competition, not that anybody wants this, but that it would potentially substitute for active warfare as each side learns from the other how much they're willing to spend and what kind of risks they're willing to take. And we have, in fact, in history, a number of examples where countries avoided war because of arms races, or at least arms races played an important role in helping them avoid open warfare.
Okay. So how would your research be relevant for policymakers seeking to offset rivals and achieve deterrence? Do you think that policymakers focus too much on the amount that a rival spends on military versus the arms they actually procure?
Well, so one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that people who do things are usually better at doing them than somebody who's watching from a distance. The conceit of academics is to sometimes pretend that they know something better than the actual practitioners. But one thing that I think we can bring to the table is that people who are deeply involved in a process will sometimes, while they intuit that process correctly, will maybe not see the kind of forest for the trees kinds of things. And there is some risk that they get caught up in certain elements of it and downplay other things that may be important or helpful. So in the US-China case, we're hopeful that some of our scholarship helps the United States, for example, make good choices about how to do things in a complex environment with multiple allies, and how to use those allies as kind of a backstop, but also a complement to the kinds of things that the US is doing.
So how do you see technologies like cyber, AI, and space systems fitting into your offset logic of arms racing? Do you think that emerging technologies make arms races more likely to spiral, or could they actually stabilize rivalries by creating new options for asymmetric balance?
Regrettably, the answer I'm going to give you is yes to both, potentially. It's a tough call when you have complex, contrasting tendencies. Which one has sort of the bigger net effect? I'm hopeful that these new technologies will allow countries to avoid the worst forms of warfare. In fact, I've done some work for USCYBERCOM where I look at the possibility that cyber might be a domain in which the US could rectify some of the security problems it has without going to open warfare. But there's always a risk, and the more complicated a space becomes, the more likely that an error will seep in some way. And the best that we can do is to be mindful of that risk and try to inform ourselves as well as we can about what those risks, what those liabilities look like.
So how could smaller powers, or without clear rivals, adapt to this strategic environment that is dominated by asymmetric arms racing between great powers like the US and China? So can bandwagoning states also develop effective offset strategies, even with more limited resources?
Yeah, great question. One of my former PhD students, who's a co-author on this paper, has done some very important work on how allies complement each other in terms of creating their military capabilities. So one of the things the US has that's an important advantage that China doesn't have is an extensive portfolio of allies and security partners, and they can play a really important role in this process.
Got it. So your analysis uses the distribution of military capabilities dataset to determine symmetry and asymmetry. So could you talk more about some of the values and the limitations of using this dataset for determining the strategic intent and timing of arms racing?
Yeah. The hardest thing to do in any human social phenomena is understanding what people are thinking between their ears. When you go to the airport, what we'd really like to have is an intention detector, a little machine that would tell if you intend to be a terrorist if you get on the airplane. What we have, unfortunately, is a metal detector that can tell people whether you're carrying metal with you, but not whether you're going to do something nasty or benign with that thing. And so the hardest nut to crack for humans forever is to figure out what other humans are going to do.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with me today.